Pakistan Taliban warn of more violence after claiming Monday's deadly blast in Peshawar. So, is Pakistan paying the price for the US's so-called war on terror? And what does that mean for Islamabad's strategic alliance with Washington? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Nick Clark. The Pakistani Taliban have claimed responsibility for an attack on the US consulate in Peshawar on Monday. The consulate is considered one of the most highly guarded buildings in the region. The assault including armed men and 2 car bombs. And one of the bombs exploded at a checkpoint 50 meters away from the consulate. The other was detonated nearer to the building gates. No Americans were hurt in the incident, but at least 6 Pakistanis were killed, including 4 of the attackers. Now, the leader of the Taliban in Pakistan said Americans were their enemies and that they would carry out further attacks. The assault has been described as well thought out, despite not causing the chaos intended. It came on the same day that a suicide bomber killed at least 44 people at a political rally in Lower Dir district. Observers have speculated that the attacks could be in revenge for US drone bombings targeting Taliban fighters in the Swat Valley. Those unmanned planes dropped bombs and have been criticized for killing civilians. Well, now to discuss all this from Islamabad, we have Imtiaz Alam, the editor of the South Asia Journal. Mohammed Idris Ahmed is a sociologist based at the University of Strathclyde. He's also the co-editor of pulsemedia.org, joining us from Glasgow. And from Washington, D.C., we have Richard White, a fellow at the Hudson Institute. Gentlemen all, welcome to the programme. Imtiaz Alam, if I may start with you. The Taliban have regrouped, it seems, and are planning and executing a new wave of attacks.
Yes, indeed. After getting beaten up in Swat and South Waziristan, and where their headquarters were destroyed and their network was eliminated, they found a sanctuary elsewhere in North Waziristan, and they have been under great pressure in the recent weeks. Just not in one agency, but in various agencies like Orakzai and Mamand and Khyber and other areas. So they have retaliated because they were being punched a lot, very hard.
Okay, well, let's, Idris Ahmed, how do you think the Taliban have managed to regroup in such a way? Are you surprised?
I'm not surprised at all, because I think it is the nature of guerrilla insurgencies that whenever the heat is on, so they just disperse. And that is what happened when Pakistan has committed more than 150,000 soldiers. And as a consequence, they dispersed. They laid low for a while, and as soon as the opportunity presented itself, so they have struck back. And I think that that is precisely why I find this language of hitting hard and all quite questionable, because this is fundamentally not a military problem. This is a political problem, and until the political issues are addressed underlying this issue, so it is not likely that any military success will be lasting.
All right, Richard White, it demonstrates a failure in that case, doesn't it, on behalf of the Pakistani government, the Pakistani military, and indeed US tactics in the region?
I wouldn't necessarily say that. I agree with the preceding speaker that the primary long-term solution will depend on political, economic, and other developments. But in terms of the military campaign, as far as people can tell, it's been successful in weakening the insurgents. Now, remember, they trained a large number of suicide bombers and other fighters when they basically were left alone for a while in some of these temporary truces, or because they dispersed earlier. So even though they've lost some, they still have capabilities, and so they probably still have many people who are trained to conduct these attacks.
But don't these attacks have a level of sophistication that we haven't seen in recent times?
I'm not sure about that. I mean, that would be true if you compared it, say, about 5 years ago. But for the past year or so, some of the attacks on the Pakistani military have been equally sophisticated. I don't want to generalize from one incident. As we know, there are lots of incidents in this region, and the shifting balances are only apparent when you look at trend lines over months. So I wouldn't want to stress too much about what one case tells us about the effectiveness of the counterinsurgency strategy in that region.
Okay, Imtiaz Alam, given the controversy and the pain that drone attacks cause and the response that we've seen that has elicited from the Taliban, it seems that such offensives simply aren't working. The strategy isn't working.
No, I don't think so. I think the situation is much better now than it was 1 year ago. And we have seen a seriousness on the part of the Pakistani government. Under the new democratic government, the policy was much more supported by the people at large and with the backing of the political government and the parliament. The people were having a lot of problems and they were giving a lot of sacrifices. Young and old and women and children all were being killed. So now the situation is much better in the sense that, of course, there has to be a lasting political solution. But the void they found and they fill in, the Taliban, had to be filled by the state to extend the Pakistani state's threat to those areas which have been ungovernable in the past.
Idris Ahmed, the situation is in fact much better.
Well, I'm not sure if you can say that, considering what has been happening in the past 6 months. In fact, the major escalation in the Taliban attacks, especially on the cities, have occurred in these past 6 months, and that is why the government's recent claims that they had won a victory, were rather dubious, considering that they had made similar claims even back after the assault on Swat. And after that, the conflict has simmered. And in fact, there are other reports. For example, there may be temporary lulls, but considering what is happening, for example, just if you pick up today's Washington Post, there's a report by Karen DeYoung where she points out that there have been 300 extrajudicial killings. And these are the same things that the US is carrying out as well. I mean, if you look at what the drones policy is, it is precisely extrajudicial killing. And that is not just my words, those are the words of the US ambassador in 2001, July 2001, when they described them as such, in reference to the Israeli extrajudicial killings. So that policy has now been globalized. So I think that the policy, as we can see, the escalation of the attacks on the cities, so there has been a considerable worsening of the situation in these past 6 months. So I won't say that the military response to it has in any way improved the situation.
Let's bring in Richard Weitz from Washington. What do you say to that?
Well, again, it depends on a bit of the trends and the point of comparison. I think that compared to what we saw maybe a year ago, 2 years ago, when large regions of the country appeared to be under insurgent influence, there were terrorist attacks in the major cities, I think the situation has improved somewhat. Again, we all agree that a military campaign will not end the insurgency altogether. That said, the military campaign can put pressure on the insurgents, weaken them, and make them perhaps more accommodating to some kind of settlement, an enduring settlement, which would allow what I think is the hope of the U.S. administration, the Pakistani government, and others, that we can then come in and help economically develop the region, integrate it more closely with the rest of Pakistan, make Pakistan and Afghanistan work together well in terms of joint border development. So I still think that the situation has been improving over the last couple of years, if you take that as your trend line.
Okay, well, the situation has had pressure added to it from going from one way, from the States towards Pakistan. US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, of course, went for the jugular when she was in Pakistan in October last year. Speaking to a group of newspaper editors in Lahore, she questioned Pakistan's willingness to take on the terrorists. She said, "I find it hard to believe that nobody in your government, in the Pakistani government, knows where they are and couldn't get them if they really wanted to." Imtiaz Alam, isn't one of the big problems here that those that threaten are in fact the state's own creation? Pakistan pretty much invented the Taliban, didn't it?
That's right. Even the Pakistani Taliban were created by General Musharraf to fight the Afghan Taliban, but they turned their guns on Islamabad. And moreover, I would like to refer the previous commentator that here in Pakistan and elsewhere, the religious extremists take this position. Unless the NATO forces or ISAF forces withdraw from Afghanistan, there will not be settlement or there will not be peace in Pakistan, and there will not be an end to attacks on the civilian targets in Pakistan. But the state of Pakistan, which created these people, and the Taliban and other extremists found sanctuaries in the areas where there was no right of the state had to act. And after this government had took over, which is a democratic government, and the people's opinion and public opinion rallied around the government against this menace, I think some progress has been made. We should be, I'm not saying that, as was claimed by some sections of the establishment here in Pakistan, that they have won a victory. I think that is far away. But it has to be, it has the state of Pakistan, and the establishment will have to stand up firm, while of course allowing political space for negotiations at the same time. But this is a time for that Pakistani state extends its writ to areas from where these extremists are operating.
Idris Ahmed, I'm going to bring you in just a second, but first, Richard White, what would you like? How would you like to respond to that?
No, I think that the comments are correct, that the Taliban, probably also the Afghan Taliban, as well as the Pakistani Taliban, are something of creation of state policies. Secretary Clinton was expressing a concern among some that the government has been willing to fight the Pakistani Taliban, but not necessarily the Afghan Taliban or Al-Qaeda, since they're not seen as much as a direct threat and potentially useful for Pakistani influence in Afghanistan when the NATO and U.S. troops withdraw. And in that context, the plan is for the U.S. and NATO troops to withdraw. They just want to make sure that when they leave, it'll be something what we're hoping to see is going to occur in Iraq, have some kind of government in place with a competent security forces that can maintain order and peace in that country. So the long-term vision, again, is the same. It's just the question of tactics and strategy might vary.
Okay, Idris Ahmed, how much support do you think the Taliban has within the hierarchy, within the Pakistani hierarchy, and how much influence do you think that brings to bear on the situation as we see it right now?
Well, I would like to first give a bit of a historical context here. The Taliban in Afghanistan, they were, I wouldn't say created, but they were certainly encouraged by the Pakistani establishment in the mid-90s. And at that time, Pakistan wasn't the only one. And I won't say that Pakistani Taliban were created either. Pakistani Taliban were a response to the Pakistani military's actions in the tribal regions. Now, what is happening at present is certainly there's a distinction being made by the Pakistani state between the Pakistani Taliban, between its response to the Pakistani Taliban and the Afghan Taliban. And the response is simple, the difference is simple. It sees the Pakistani Taliban as threatening the writ of the state, whereas it sees the Afghan Taliban as an asset because of the encroachment of Indian influence in Afghanistan. So that is why if you see today, now the biggest military exercise in 20 years has been announced by the Pakistani state, precisely at a time when pressure on it is high. But this has been announced not on the northwest frontier, but on its eastern frontier, because for Pakistan, the primary issue is the issue of Kashmir and the vulnerability it feels because of a U.S. growing relationship with India and the recent arms sales and everything else. And I think the U.S. strategy right now is rather myopic, which is arming India at the same time as now it has started selling arms to Pakistan as well. So I think it only militarizes the region further and it creates further instability.
Richard White, the U.S. strategy is myopic.
The India-Pakistan issue is complex from the U.S. point of view. I mean, ideally, the United States would love to see that dispute settled, because then Pakistan could focus on the problem in Afghanistan and within its own borders, and India could assist the United States with some other foreign policy goals. The Pakistani delegation that was here a couple weeks ago included the foreign minister and the head of the military. They presented a list of issues they would like the United States to support, and one of them was contributing to a resolution of the Kashmir dispute. The Indian government is uncomfortable with any foreign intervention. That said, there was a recent media report that came out, I think, a day or two ago, saying that President Obama had instructed the U.S. diplomatic corps to start working more vigorously towards a settlement. So the idea is not to arm both sides so that they can go have yet another war. The idea is trying to get them focused on other issues, and as part of that, give them nuclear assistance, military assistance, economic assistance, in the case of Pakistan, and to encourage, to sustain the relationship. As we know, U.S. relations with both countries has historically been strained at various points, and the U.S. tools of influence are somewhat limited.
Okay, well, they were trying to address that, as you just mentioned, as you alluded to, when diplomats from the US and Pakistan met recently, the most recent meeting involving Washington, telling the Pakistanis that what's expected of them. But in the meeting last month, when a high-level Pakistani delegation visited the US that you were just talking about for a week-long dialogue, the Pakistan foreign minister and the army chief met their US counterparts, and they presented a 56-page wish list detailing ways the United States could do more to help Pakistan. And they discussed several issues: economic development, education, energy, agriculture amongst them. And as always, strategic interests and security top the agenda. Imtiaz Alam, are the Taliban's aims of toppling the government, of imposing an Islamic State, and ultimately, I guess, getting hold of nuclear weapons, are they attainable in any way?
I think this is this bogey is being raised again and again. I don't think that Pakistani state is so weak that a private militia or Taliban can take it over, unless the army converts to the ideology of Taliban and becomes itself a Taliban kind of outfit. And that is not the case. There have been some elements who have been working very closely with these elements in the tribal areas and elsewhere, and they were influenced by those elements, private elements. But now I think a very clear line is drawn. Army got disappointed with so many of its proteges and surrogates who have been trained and patronized by them, and who turned their guns ultimately on Islamabad, and they went up to the extent of taking over GHQ and kept people hostage in the GHQ general headquarters for over 21 hours. So now the line is drawn in the sense that the Pakistani army has gradually learned, and it has still to learn more lessons, that these private elements or militias are in no way can be an instrument for their strategic objectives. And they have to fight out these elements or demobilize these elements. And that is what is gradually happening. And I don't think that in the last year what we have seen is that the army has fought well in Swat and in South Waziristan. And they had very high level of casualties, including officers. And the way the Taliban and other elements humiliated the dead bodies, that in fact created a big bad blood between the army and the insurgents.
Okay.
And the reports are maybe right.
Let me just get more of an impression.
Army.
Let me get more of an impression of what the popular feeling is in Pakistan. Idris Ahmed, how popular are the Taliban within the country?
Well, I actually am from the Northwest, so I was there recently, and I won't say that, I mean, popularity is probably not the right word to use. It's not a question of popularity at all. Extremism is overwhelmingly over there seen as a problem and something that needs to be challenged. The only thing is that people are not sure that the way the government is approaching it is the right way to deal with it. So if there was a poll conducted just in late October, and the poll was, the conclusions were simple. The people think that the majority, 66% of the people actually think that it's the government, Pakistani government and the United States, they together are more the cause of the insecurity there. And only 25% were blaming the Taliban at the time. That doesn't mean that the Taliban is popular. That only means that people are laying the blame on the government policy. So there is no sympathy for the Taliban. The only problem is that in many of these regions, Fatah region, Swat region, because the policy has been so indiscriminate, most of the people have started self-identifying as the Taliban, because it is turning into very much an ethnic war. What has happened is also, it is related to the, Imtiaz was just mentioning the way the military is dealing with it, but I think that he is overlooking a very significant factor, that the military has been careful not to commit Pashtun forces in most instances instances because they thought that there's going to be a natural sympathy. And as a result, they have been committing the Chitral Scouts, they have been committing forces from Punjab. And last year, the videos emerged of Punjabi forces who were basically abusing these Pashtun Taliban elderly. So that caused a lot of resentment over there at the time. So I think that this is in the long term a rather myopic policy, and it could lead to unit breakdown in the military, and which is the higher danger, because Imtiaz is right that the Taliban don't pose a threat which is significant enough that can ever overthrow the Pakistani government or
this just
get their hands on the nukes.
Brings me on to the next issue and very final issue, Richard Weitz. Isn't it right to say that the Taliban are in a sense reinventing themselves as a Pashto nationalist force, and that's the danger here?
That's been a problem both in Afghanistan and probably lesser case in Pakistan. Afghanistan has been a particular problem that after they lost power and started regrouping along the Afghan-Pakistan border, the Taliban started to play up the Pashtun nationalist card as rather than the Islamic extremism card, and that naturally gives you tribal allegiances and can position yourself against the Northern Alliance, which is seen as from a different element. Now, the Afghan government has made some progress on that. In Pakistan, I'm not sure if it's so much a Pashtun issue as the problem that the regions where the conflicts are taking place have traditionally been somewhat separate from the rest of Pakistan, more distant from Islamabad, having a lot of autonomy, which has meant that they've developed a sort of separate sense of identity, particularly hostile to outsiders, be them American or Pakistani or whatever. I suspect the Arabs there are not particularly popular either. But that whole region needs to be better integrated into the Afghan-Pakistan area. Now, I don't want to hyphenate them that way directly, but I think that border region could serve a really useful mechanism to help bring the two countries together over the long term with trade and economic development.
All right. Well, it's certainly a complex issue, but we've had a good old crack at trying to deal with it. Gentlemen, thanks very much indeed. Richard Weitz, Imtiaz Alam, and Mohammed Idris Ahmed. Thanks for your views and your perspectives on this issue. Okay, we've just got a little time left for some feedback from our viewers. Yesterday, we were talking about the murder of the South African white supremacist Eugene Terre-Blanche. He was found, of course, beaten to death on his farm last weekend. Mubusi Makiana says from South Africa, the statements made by the leader of the right-wing Afrikaner racist group on the programme are very inflammatory and against the spirit of building a united and prosperous South Africa. Land disputes are inevitable because these same white farmers do not want to comply with South African law. Another comment we had was from Renate van Rooyen in Heilbron, who says, I am a white South African lady. The world does not really know what's going on in South Africa. The government took away our commandos that protect us. They also took away all our rifles and guns. And now the youth leader of the ruling party sings, kill the Boers, kill the farmers, a song that was sung 20 years ago. Why? We don't believe in apartheid. And finally, this view from Monkwe Sholetsane in Johannesburg, who says, I'm a black South African and very positive about my country. We have problems between blacks and whites and rich and poor. I don't think we're under siege. With all our challenges, I believe this is still a fun and brilliant country to live in. I feel safe in my house and everywhere I go. Come to the World Cup, he says, and enjoy this country. So there you go. Any comments or thoughts on today's programme? Just email us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. We look forward to hearing from you. From me, Nick Clark. Bye for now.